Welcome, everyone. My name is Jessica Reed, and I am a journal development specialist at Canadian Science Publishing. I help develop strategies to build community and strengthen the quality of our environmental science journals. I'm joined today by my colleagues Rebecca and Hillary, and I'm speaking to you today from Tecumseh or Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm still fairly new to these lands. I've only moved here in September, so I still have a lot to learn about the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit lands that I have recently settled on. As for Canadian Science Publishing, our head offices are on Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, but we support researchers and communities all across Turtle Island and beyond. We work hard to dismantle harmful and exclusionary publishing practices and honor the expertise of Indigenous knowledges and scholarship. So if you haven't done so already, at the beginning, I was inviting everyone to let us know where you're joining in from in the chat, recognizing treaties where applicable. So I invite you to continue to do so as we get started here. A bit about Canadian Science Publishing. We are an independent, not-for-profit publisher who places researchers at the heart of our operations. Researcher-led and community-focused, we work together to move research forward. We publish some of Canada's longest-running and most respected scientific journals, which were initiated by the Canada National Research Council many years ago. We are committed to advancing excellence in scientific journal publishing through openness, ethics, and collaboration. We have active partnerships with over 35 scholarly societies and organizations, including our new partnership with the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation. I'm very excited that Steve, Meagan, Jennifer, and John could join us today. So without further ado and further verbal disruptions, over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Jessica. Hey, folks. So my name is Steve Cooke. I'm a professor at Carleton University, which is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. And I'm a professor. I'm a fish head. I love fish. That's what I do in sort of my day job. But I've picked up this hobby as a scholar as well. And that hobby is really trying to bridge that gap between knowledge and action, or knowledge and practice. And there's a variety of ways in which one can do that. And one of the ways that I've decided to spend some of my time is on delivering evidence syntheses that can be used by practitioners to tell them essentially what works and what doesn't. And that's sort of at the core of the relationship between our organization, the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation, and Canada Science Publishing. As you're probably aware, Canadian Science Publishing has a number of titles that are in the environmental space, things like Canadian Journal of Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences, Canadian Journal of Zoology, and so on. And it even has a reviews focused journal, Environmental Reviews. So clearly, Canadian Science Publishing has for quite some time recognized the value of evidence syntheses and making sure that they're available, published, accessible to various users. So that's sort of where we're coming from today. This is one of several webinars that we anticipate hosting. So if you have any ideas for follow-up work, things you'd like to learn about, certainly throw those in the chat or in a follow-up survey that will be shared with you. We're really only able to scratch the surface today in 1 hour. There's lots of other voices that we would love to be able to center and hear from, other folks that work within this ecosystem, diverse knowledge generators, knowledge holders, knowledge users, and so on. So today is really just the start of a series of conversations that we will have. So with that, let's flip to the next slide. And today, I'm going to get us going with a presentation called Mobilizing Evidence Syntheses to Inform Environmental Decision Making, or Environmental Decision Makers. And the way we're gonna kick things off, I'm gonna do about a 15-minute presentation, and then I will introduce 3 panelists. The panelists will go through a couple of questions that we've come up with ahead of time, and then we'll be able to come to you for any additional questions, comments, thoughts, and so on, and see what we can squeeze into the next hour. So with that, you can take me to the next slide, please. So across the world, across North America, across Canada, on a daily basis, there's There's thousands and thousands of environmental practitioners, environmental policymakers, managers that are making decisions. We call those environmental decisions. Some of those are routine issues made at perhaps the level of one desk or several people that work in an office together. It's everything from plan review for new developments. It might be coming up with restoration plans, fish and wildlife management, forestry operations, licensing of aggregates, and so on. And folks operate at different levels. Some municipal governments are even active in this space, particularly as it relates to planning, right up through our state, provincial, federal, and then international bodies such as the UN and IUCN. So point is, there's lots of decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. There's also really big decisions that are made. These tend to be made by politicians, informed, of course, by the folks that work for them and support them. So, for example, here we've got a picture of large dam being constructed or a large pipeline. In Canada, decisions around these files tend to be made by cabinet as opposed to by on-the-ground practitioners. Again, practitioners informing, but not the ones making the decisions themselves. Next slide. And so lots of decisions, big and small, that relate to the environment, resource management, and biodiversity. And we spend lots and lots of money to undertake those various endeavors. We install wildlife crossings and fishways. We create wetlands. We translocate organisms. We enact policies and regulations, make decisions about different pharmaceutical products and thresholds and so on. So there's a lot of decisions that are being made. And the question is, and this is a question I think we should all be asking both as folks interested in the environment and as citizens, are we basing those decisions and actions on the best available evidence? Next slide. So I'm going to draw your attention to a paper that Andrew Pullen and colleagues published back in 2004. And it was an important paper in my mind. It really opened our eyes, the conservation community, to the fact that conservation managers, environmental managers, weren't necessarily taking advantage of all the great science that many of you are doing. Basically, this was a survey of land managers in the UK, and they revealed that conservation actions are largely experience-based and rely heavily on traditional management practices. In other words, you stick with the status quo. This is how we've always done things. This is how we're going to continue to do things. And that really made it clear that managers are not making full or systematic use of all the information that's out there to support their decision making. We've followed up in Canada and elsewhere around the world with similar surveys, and indeed, this holds true. So this is something that's a well-known phenomenon. Next slide. This should be alarming, again, as taxpayers, as people that care about the environment. There's timeliness to a lot of these environmental decisions. We've got a biodiversity and climate crisis, so there's a sense of urgency. But most of our environmental decisions, if we get it wrong, there are consequences. And those consequences oftentimes last for decades, centuries, or perhaps many generations. We also have limited resources. If we're going to spend money, spend time doing an environmental intervention or a conservation intervention, we need to make sure that that money is being well spent. And so we want to make sure that the best available evidence is informing those decisions. Next slide. And so going back to, again, that Pullen paper from 2004, that really led to what I like to call an awakening. Our community started to realize, wow, we really need to push for this idea of evidence-based, or more recently, what we're calling evidence-informed conservation. And so really the talk today and much of what we do in the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation is about this. So how do we deliver on the promise of evidence-based or evidence-informed conservation and environmental management? Next slide. So the question perhaps to ask as a starting point is why? Why are practitioners, environmental decision makers, not making full use of all the information that's out there? So let's start off with the basics. There's simply too much for decision makers to wade through. There's about 5.1 million papers published per year, 64 million papers since 1996, 30,000 plus journals, and that number increases annually. And much of the literature that's out there is inaccessible. Fortunately, that latter point, things are getting a little better with open access, but still, more than half of the literature that's out there is inaccessible to folks that are making decisions. So, not most of these folks are not embedded within universities where we have access to interlibrary loan. We've seen evidence of libraries associated with governments being cut. So challenges in trying to get their hands on this information. And so this has been called, in fact, in a Canadian science publishing blog, the 21st century science overload. Next slide. We also know that peer review is imperfect. So a decision maker goes out, they stumble upon a paper like, wow, this is great. It was published in a fancy journal. But it turns out, and this is a quote from Pedro Perez Neto, a Canadian based at Concordia, and he said that peer review is increasingly about deciding not if a paper gets published, but where it gets published. And I agree that that's indeed the case today. There are certainly a number of what we'll call low rent, dodgy outlets out there that where one can find a home for virtually anything. That's led myself and a number of colleagues to muse about perhaps embracing a harm reduction approach to improving peer review by essentially acknowledging its imperfections. We know it's imperfect, so what can we do to try and mitigate those imperfections? I'd love to talk about that, but don't have time to go much beyond that for today. So we'll go on to the next slide. We're also facing a reproducibility crisis. So this is to the left there, the figure is showing survey responses or a paper that was published in Nature, where over half of the respondents indicated that there was a significant crisis. There was a study published in Science that explored a number of psychological related studies and found that only 36% of those studies had been replicated, despite the fact that many of them push various interventions that are then embraced by decision makers. So we've got a challenge. Yes, there's science being generated, and we want our decision makers to use that science. But a lot of the science that's out there hasn't been reproduced. So we don't know the extent to which those patterns are generalizable, how they work in different contexts. And if we think about the environment, maybe in different ecosystems and different ecoregions with different taxa and so on. Next slide. We also have the file drawer effect. So this is the idea that there's been a tendency to only publish findings where there's something that's fantastically significant. This is something that historically journals were certainly at the core of, and editors serving as gatekeepers. But it sort of became so entrenched within the community that if we as researchers did work, we wouldn't even try and publish it if it wasn't significant. And so this is problematic because it means that when things don't work or don't work out, we don't share those stories. So again, hence the file drawer effect, where things just get tucked away and forgotten about. Next slide. And so all of this and a number of other things contribute to bias, or our susceptibility to bias. So yes, most of us on this call here are scientists, trained scientists, but we're also human beings, and we are all flawed in our own special ways. And as humans, it's very easy to make selective use of scientific evidence. You can go to the literature and find 100 papers, 99 of which say one thing, and one say something else. And you can pick the one that says something else, the so-called alternative viewpoint, and decide that that's the piece of evidence that you're going to move forward with or use to shape your own perspectives. We also know that primary studies, so papers that are empirical papers, for example, that are published in journals, vary in the extent to which they're trustworthy, depending on the design, the execution, analysis, and so on. And I want to be clear here. Not everything that's published in peer-reviewed journals is good, and not everything in gray literature is bad. The point is you really have to dig in and look at each study on its own merits. Next slide. So All of this points toward the need to do something a little bit different. And there are a variety of ways in which to enact or embrace evidence-informed decision-making. What I'm going to talk about today is evidence synthesis, which is the process of identifying, compiling, and combining relevant knowledge from multiple sources so it's readily available for different decision makers, end users, whoever is interested in that type of information. Next slide. So why do we conduct evidence syntheses? Might be to provide a summary of the evidence on a broad or large topic, to identify potential areas for research, to compare previous findings, to critique existing evidence, and to identify similar work that's done on subject of interest. And we'll drill into this a little bit further in our panel discussion. Next slide. There are lots of approaches to evidence synthesis. You're not going to be able to read this, but my point is there are a bunch, and each come with their own strengths and limitations. I would point you to this article by Cooke in Biological Conservation from 2017, which provides a nice overview of all the different evidence, or the majority of the different evidence synthesis methods that are used. But I'm going to drill down in the next slide to just a few of these. And what I'm going to do is take what I consider to be the two ends of the spectrum, what we'll call a traditional literature review and a systematic review. And so a traditional literature review is something that I think most of us are familiar with. I think probably everybody's done one, maybe in undergrad, maybe the first chapter in your thesis for a master's or a PhD. The challenge is that they are subject to bias. They vary in their comprehensiveness. Study quality is rarely assessed, and it essentially ends up just being a compilation of references. They tend not to provide any information on how things were done. If one of you were to do a literature review on a topic and I was to do a literature review on the same topic, we might actually come up with different conclusions. Contrast that with systematic review, which is an approach that was really refined in the medical space. In those cases, you need a clear, well-defined question, access to all literature, including the gray literature. It's transparent, objective, repeatable, and updatable. It's robust to criticism, tries to minimize bias, and it includes, importantly, a critical appraisal of the quality of evidence. So instead of just saying, oh, we found this paper and they conclude X, you actually drill into the paper to figure out whether or not those conclusions actually are justified based on the study design, the statistical power, and so on. And you'd be surprised at how often that is not the case. I will note that either of these approaches can include meta-analysis. You can do a meta-analysis on a very biased data set, or you can do meta-analysis embedded within a systematic review that focuses on a body of literature where you've attempted to minimize bias. For our work, we lean on the guidance that's provided by the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which is a UK-based charity trust focused on providing information on how to conduct high-quality evidence syntheses. It's not a fancy club that you have to pay to join. It's a community of practice that I encourage you to check out to learn more about how to do this type of thing. And as I mentioned, this is the norm. Systematic review, high-quality evidence syntheses are the norm in medicine and healthcare, and they're just starting to be embraced in the environmental space. Next. I like to use this example as to why this is important. And so every couple of years, I teach an Introduction to Environmental Science course at Carleton University. And in that first year course, students are asked to do their first literature review, their first evidence synthesis. And we have them pick their own topics. And of course, the topic of the day, there's always a handful of students that want to look at the effects of climate change on polar bears. And we, rather than steering them all into different topics, we'll allow that. So there'll be 2 or 3 of them maybe that take on the same topic. And each year, invariably, we will end up with one literature review that will conclude with enormous certainty that polar bears will be extinct within the next 10 or 15 years, that climate change is going to wipe them out. And we'll have another couple of papers that will conclude confidently that polar bears are going to be everywhere, they're going to do just fine, and that climate change is probably good for them. And so how can that happen? How can you possibly end up with those same two conclusions? And it just goes back to bias. We are literally that biased as humans. We have preconceived notions as to how the world works. And when doing a literature, we bring that bias to everything we do, from the search terms we use, the papers that we decide to include, and so on, what we deem to be valid or useful information to include versus exclude. So I just find that to be such a telling example. And it starts early, right? Nobody went out intentionally to try to fudge their answer. They just had a preconceived idea of how the world worked. And sure enough, that's what they found when they actually did their review. Next slide. So, what do we know about decision makers and how they interact with evidence syntheses of various kinds? With some funding from NSERC a couple years ago, we interviewed 84 senior environmental professionals in Canada working at the science policy interface, mostly working for federal, provincial, territorial governments. And we found, next slide, we found two things. So first of all, I just want to share that these different synthesis methods are ranked from the most rigorous on the left to the least rigorous on the right. And what you see here for the solid bars is the confidence of decision makers in a given type of review, and then the stippled ones indicate how often they'll use them. So let's look to the far left there. We see systematic reviews are the ones that they are most confident in, so appearing in 80% of the top three choices of the folks that responded. Yet they weren't the most used. Sorry, they were still among the most used, but not used as often as perhaps I would have liked. And so we heard that over and over again in some of the more qualitative questions. If they are available, we will use them over anything else that's available. The problem is, rarely are they available when we need them on the topic that we need them on. And then you can see it sort of goes across the board there, meta-analyses, summaries, all the way over there to vote counting. So this, this warms my heart. We have a receptive group of decision makers that know what systematic reviews are and want to use them if they are available. Next slide. So as I wrap up and we transition to our panel discussion, this is Andrew Pullen, who was the founder of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And I love this quote: "The paradigm shift in decision-making achieved through evidence-based approaches in medicine and other fields is a template for significant improvement in conservation practice." And it was in 2013, I invited Andrew to Ottawa. We sat around our dining room table talking about this. And it was after his visit and the frustration that I'd had in terms of trying to move my science into that decision-making space, I realized that there was a need to develop some capacity in Canada in particular around evidence synthesis. And so that's when the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation was founded. Next slide. So just to wrap things up, some highlights. We know that if provided with robust syntheses that they can be confident in, decision makers will use them and recognize their value. So that's decision makers waving to us, scientists, those that are knowledge generators, whoever happens to be wearing those hats that's on the call. That's telling us that they would like us to see these kinds of things done and done well. But the lack of available high quality syntheses for many environmental issues means that their use is somewhat limited and opportunistic. And so part of our mission as a center, and really this partnership, is to bring awareness for the need to build capacity for conducting robust evidence syntheses and for their use. So within government agencies, training staff, working on cultural changes to embrace and use evidence, thinking about academic institutions and how we can better train our students and postdocs to be able to do both the evidence synthesis side, but also understand and respect and how to interpret these types of products if they're wearing more of a policy hat when they happen to graduate. And then finally, one of the things we're here to talk about today is the role of publishers and journals in terms of training, thinking about editorial policy, and so on. And that's one of the directions that we will go with our panel discussion. I believe that's the last slide. So here we are. So thanks for your attention, folks. I would like to now introduce the three panelists that will be joining me. I will serve as moderator, and each of them will provide a little bit more fulsome introduction in their response to the first question. So first, I would like to introduce Meagan Harper, who is a PhD student at Carleton University. Next, Dr. Jennifer Provencher, who is a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then lastly, Dr. John Smol, who's a professor of environmental science at Queen's University. So welcome to all of our panelists, and also a hearty, warm welcome to all of you that have taken time to join us today. And so we're going to shift to our very first question, which you can see there. And this is from your perspective. So we're going to have them tell you what hat they're putting on as they answer. Why are literature reviews / evidence syntheses worthwhile, and what are their limitations? And we're going to start with Meagan, and then we'll go to Jennifer, and then on to John. Meagan?
Hi, thanks, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, I'm a PhD student at Carleton. I also am a volunteer with the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, and I've been working with them kind of on the internal side for a number of years. So one of the things that I think is really important about literature reviews and evidence syntheses is it helps us take a moment to understand what we know currently and areas where we don't understand a topic very well. So it allows researchers and managers to identify locations where we have enough information to make a decision, and also areas where we might not have enough information and we need to do further research or to look into particular aspect of the topic more. As a student, evidence syntheses are really helpful when you're starting out learning about a new topic. So instead of having to read 100 papers, when you don't know the terms, you don't understand what's going on in this new topic, you find an evidence synthesis, something like a systematic map or something like that, and you can really get a good grounding in the topic that allows you to look further. And they also provide databases that you can go and check out other people's methodologies and things like that. So that can be really helpful. I think that because there are so many different types of evidence syntheses out there, you can answer a lot of different types of questions with them. And I think that's really amazing. Some of the limitations of evidence syntheses, they're only as good as the methods that you develop to do them. So it just like primary research, it takes some time to really think about the methodology, really think about where you're coming from and where your position is, and then try and minimize those biases as you go forward so that you're not producing something that would answer a question that you didn't intend to ask in the first place. I also think that one of the issues that we face as evidence synthesis, and this is something that Collaboration for Environmental Evidence faces all the time, is that once an evidence synthesis search is done, it becomes out of date really quickly. So trying to keep up with the literature can be a real challenge. I think I'm going to stop there and let the other panelists pitch in.
Thanks, Meagan. On to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks, Steve, for the introduction. So I'm a government scientist. I'm a research scientist for our federal body in Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm also adjunct at, Queen's and Carleton and a few other universities represented here. So I kind of come from this both, and I appreciate hearing Meagan's ideas as a student and learner, right? How useful these are. And I think that is incredibly important. But what I want to focus on, again, is wearing my government scientist hat, is really the interface between, what I would often call the elusive policymaker and research. So as a government scientist, I work on contaminants, I work on pathogens. So when SARS-CoV-2 was detected in wildlife and animals, avian influenza, DDT, plastic pollution, I know exactly where those policymakers sit. They're not the hypothetical policymakers. They sometimes sit down the hall and they're the ones who are responsible for, reporting back whether Canada's increasing levels of mercury or is for, reason A or reason B, or is DDT still going down? And so I have this really interesting relationship with policymakers where I know where they sit, I know where their, first names are. And sometimes those people are very new, and sometimes those people have been on those files for, 15, 20 years. And so there's a few things on why these evidence synthesis are really worthwhile. One is, in a similar way to what Meagan said, we have policymakers who change topics, right? It is very rare that we have a policymaker who sits in that kind of lead on a specific policy for their entire career. And so these evidence syntheses are really important to catching up policymakers who are not just sitting on one policy, right? They often have to sit on a whole bunch of different, places and track a whole bunch of different files. It allows them to understand the direction the literature is going, right? I don't have to send them 100 papers. We can send them an evidence synthesis. They can kind of get the feel for it, and then we can have a much more in-depth dialogue. And that has been super, super useful. The other piece that Steve really touched upon and is in that paper is we often have to make a decision when the policy is ready, or either the political or public scrutiny of an issue is kind of come to a head. We don't get to sit on the science, wait for the science to be ready, and then make a policy around it. And so we are often in a landscape, and we've seen this a lot of times in the last 5-6 years, again, specifically with pathogens, SARS-CoV-2, avian influenza. What are the impacts on conservation? What are impacts on the landscape? We have to make decisions really quickly in what I would call a data poor environment. And so we need to be able to kind of bring in a whole bunch of different types of evidence synthesis and really be able to kind of crunch it down and make an evidence-informed policy decision with our policymakers, or at least make recommendations to our policymaking colleagues so that they can move forward. We can't just sit on it and say, well, can we get another year of data? Can we do another year of field work? And as you all know, when we get these zoonoses and pathogens or really dire contaminants, we need to make a decision now. And that's where we sit at this kind of government policy interface. And as a government scientist, my job is to identify those policies that might be coming down the tubes and get data for, but then also the other way around, right? Talk about what policies we need in order to understand the threats in the landscape. The one thing I would say about limitations is we, because of all the things that Meagan said and Steve said, right? They're out of date within months of publication. They're only as good as your methods. And I would say that, especially on emerging topics like zoonoses, like contaminants, like plastic pollution, right? Even sometimes the moment it's published, it's already 2 years out of date because things keep churning. That publication just keeps churning. And so it's really challenging. And so the limitations are it still takes, experience and expertise and humans to come together and bring that together. And I think while that maybe was a challenge in some of those early synthesis methods, one of the things that we've seen colleagues do, some of them are here and some of ourselves, is that marriage of evidence synthesis with that expert opinion to really try to bring it together. Because sometimes what the evidence suggests you do is biased by those studies, and in the real world just doesn't make sense. There's pros and cons. And so you need that evidence synthesis with what I collectively call the expert opinion, and we need to machinate that together in order to get really informed decisions that make sense for this moment. I'm going to leave it there, and I'll pass on to Dr. Smol.
Thanks, Jen. And I'll also note that we're aware that we don't have any environmental decision makers on this panel. Jen's the closest working in an organization that makes decisions, but is not a decision maker herself. We will be thinking about how to engage decision makers in a future webinar and get directly from them their perspective. John.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And yes, as Steve said, I'm a professor here at Queen's University in the Department of Biology as well as Environmental Studies. But I'm also heavily involved in the editing business. I became a editor-in-chief at the age of 30, the founding editor of Journal of Paleolimnology, which I was for about 20 years. And that overlapped with me becoming editor-in-chief of Environmental Reviews, which is a lit review journal, and I've been that for just over 20 years now. And I'm on the editorial board of 11 other journals right now. So I'm heavily involved in the editing, publishing business. A disadvantage coming at the end here is I think pretty well everything I thought I was going to say was already said by Steve and the two panelists. But I mean, of course, I think I'm saying what people already agree, that science and other forms of scholarship now are more important than ever. And at best, science is being underused by politicians and policymakers, and at worst is being misinterpreted, misused, and misrepresented. One big problem is we are searching for knowledge and drowning in information. We feel that every day, I think, as scientists, and that's when we're specialists. Can you imagine what it's like when you're trying to not be in that world? And specialists don't have the time to read and synthesize all the literature in their own areas, let alone areas that are peripheral but important to them. So I think from that perspective, reviews are important. It brings in stuff that's sort of on the outside of what you're doing and brings it in. And it tells you what the known knowns are, the known unknowns, and the worst is the unknown unknowns. And that's an important part. So they're important springboard. But without repeating now what everyone else said, maybe I'll just switch it slightly, which I wasn't planning on saying, but also doing it on the fly here. I'm going to look at why this is important from the perspective of early career, but also seasoned researchers, early career researchers who are actually doing the literature reviews. I tend to think in research, and talking to the researchers here, getting answers isn't all that hard in science. I think the real critical thing is asking the right questions. And the only way you're going to ask the right questions is if you have a good, solid foundation of what's been done out there. And that's one of the main reasons we ask students to do lit reviews in their thesis. Unfortunately, we tend to ask them to do it when they're writing their thesis year 4 or whatever it is. But this is a critical point, I think, that really, to ask the really big questions in science, you need that foundation of what's been done out there. And that's why that's really, really important. As far as limitations, again, without repeating what was said, I mean, we all see things through our own lenses. Steve was talking about this too. Those are the limitations, but there's other limitations, especially if you're an Anglophone, you tend to be using English literature. Now, much of science is now written in English, but there's a lot of good stuff that's old. A lot of questions were already answered, and we miss them because either they're great literature, they're in a different language, and so forth. So that makes it a little harder. But I think other than that, I think I'd be repeating what others have said. So in the interest of time and looking at the clock, why don't I leave it right there?
Fantastic. And just want to thank all the 3 panelists for those great first answers there. We're going to continue. I just want to remind the audience that there's the opportunity to ask questions. I believe the Q&A box should be available to you. If you want to throw things in there, we've got a few other folks that'll be able to look at those and bring those forward towards the end of the call. All right, with that, we move on to our next question that you can see here. This is, what are the roles of authors? And in most cases, this is going to be researchers who are doing this, editors and publishers, and the peer review enterprise in creating a culture of evidence sharing and use. So I'm going to start with Jennifer on this one, then we'll go to John and Meagan in that order.
Yeah, thanks. This is a really great question. And I have 2 points that I want to kind of emphasize. I think the one role of authors and researchers, and my students will have heard me say this, is really to be honest. Be honest about the limitations, be honest about the trends. And on the flip side, I think what the role of editors, publishers, and, peer review enterprise really is not focusing on only those results that are sensational, right? And again, holding authors to that honest, perception, the boiling down of what it means. And I think that this is a vicious feedback loop that, many people have talked about in the peer review, that, the biggest sensational things go high. Everyone needs high for different promotion and funding and tenure and all of these things. And I think that is one thing that really in this evidence synthesis world, we need to be really aware of and really kind of boil down and hold ourselves accountable, our co-authors accountable. But on the flip side, those editors and publishers need to really kind of push back on those things. And, that doesn't mean to downscale or de-emphasize, but be honest about what we can say. And again, I think, to lean on what John invoked already, right? What's the known, what's the unknown, and all the iterations in between. And I think that's really important, because the missteps in, taking science through to those kind of evidence synthesis ways to policymakers, to politicians, is part of the trap. And what goes wrong in that system is that kind of misinterpretation, that sensationalism that blows up, and it often comes from trying to boil something down that's too nuanced to a very tight line, and that's where we can get into problems. So I think that's one role that we all have to play. I think the other piece that again, I say often is as a government scientist, my group tries to aim to communicate things early and often. And so we are not the penultimate piece of, well, we have 40 years of data and we're finally ready to share it with everyone and see what it is. And again, I think that goes back to when we're doing that evidence synthesis piece, sharing early with colleagues, doing preprints of methods, understanding where that information is. Again, I think having a thoughtful plan, again, both of the authors, but then editors and publishers being creative to think about how do we share early and often, so that the people who need this information, who maybe can't wait 6 months or a year for this to come out, because they're going to a negotiating table, next week, how do they access that information? Because 100% policymakers, and again, I know some of them, some of them are just down the hall, right? They 100% read scientific papers. They don't read them all. Who does? But they need that information early and often, and in a synthesized, plain language way that, again, doesn't boil at the nuance, for them to be able to really mobilize it when it matters, right? That's the trick, is how to get this data and information to people when it matters. Because one thing that I think we forget about is that there are often policy windows. And just as an example, I know, Steve, I'll try to keep this short, but we worked on a particular project for about 10 years. We had a policy window of 30 days. And then we're not going to get another policy window for another 5 years. And that policy window is open for 30 days. If you don't have your papers and your comments ready and everything ready to go for that 30-day period, your next window is not for 5 years. And so we have to be able to map that out and see it beforehand to get all the information boiled down and ready to go. And so again, as authors, editors, publishers, we have to be able to understand that cycle and be able to mobilize things when that window opens, because policy windows wait for no one. And I'll just, even during COVID, when our research was on pause, labs were shut down, things like the Stockholm Convention met online, policy windows open, policy windows closed, and that, those policies do not get put on hold in the same way a lot of our programs do. And so we have to keep that in mind.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think, to paraphrase, sort of embedded within a lot of what you said is I think the importance of that interaction between knowledge generators and knowledge users, which is, again, that could be a whole nother session, but knowing, as John said, what are the right questions to ask, what is relevant, what makes work relevant, and building trust, so that when it comes time to use the information, there's trust in those products. So, all right, let's move on to John.
Yeah, well, sure. The role of authors, editors, publishers, peer review system, they all have different roles. And I think we all find, probably in many respects, the peer review system can be very frustrating, aggravating for many of us. But, it was more or less invented in the 1660s with the Royal Society, and it may not be perfect, but it's the best system we have. So I think it's important to keep in mind that if you think of authors, reviewers, and editors, they all have different roles. The role of the author is to produce the most honest, clearest summary of the work, with the overall goal to adding to the foundation of knowledge and placing that into the perspective of previous work, which is part of the lit review part. And solid lit reviews can play a critical role in developing the perspective of the point. So I think we understand the role of the author. The role of the reviewer is, in my view, to improve the author's submission. And science works, and this can be contentious to some extent, we have to keep in mind science works by falsification and science works by challenges. And criticism is the oxygen that makes, basically science move forward. And so your job as a reviewer is to be as constructive as possible in a way to improve the manuscript. And keeping in mind that authors write papers, not the reviewers. Your job is not to rewrite the paper, to tell authors this is not the type of study you should be doing. The authors decide what kind of study they should be doing and why they're doing it. So, and also I think remember that just as a reviewer, just that there are all these positive aspects to criticism, there are positive ways to criticize. And I guess what I'm saying is the fact that you're anonymous is not an excuse to be a jerk. The job of the editor is a hard one. Someone who's been doing it for 40 years, at least a good editor. And again, a very different job. Like the referees, their job is to find ways to improve a manuscript. And often the job of the editor is to referee the referees to some extent. And a lot of that is more than just looking which boxes were clicked, minor revision, major revisions. And a strong editor appreciates that referee reports are partly opinions. They are opinions on the paper. They're not necessarily facts. And being an editor is not a popularity contest, I can assure you that, because you won't win when you're dealing with contentious papers. A strong editor will side with the views that they judge after careful consideration, make the paper the strongest and more correct, not necessarily a view of all the external referees. So these are three different roles, and I think it's important to understand that they do have different roles. But the overall goal is to make the best paper possible, whether that's a literature review, which is the current journal I'm editing, or a general scientific journal, publishing new research.
Thanks, John. On to you, Meagan.
All right. I think so. One of the things, I work in evidence synthesis. That's primarily what I do. And one of the things that we hear from people who are getting large systematic reviews is it takes too long to read this. I'm not going to be able to digest it. I'm not going to be able to go through it as quickly as I need to meet a policy window or something like that. So I think it's important when we're setting out to do a systematic review or a large systematic map is to think about how we're going to communicate it to people who are going to be using it in an effective way. So part of my PhD, we've actually been talking with decision makers and trying to figure out how we can communicate, how we can create a communication plan early in the process so that it meets everybody's needs. So I think from an author perspective, we love doing our research, we love finding those answers, but we need to think about the way that we can move that piece of information forward. Once you've published it, that's not the end of the process. It's what you do afterwards that help get it to the next step so that it gets used in policy and things like that. As an evidence synthesis, I think it's also really important to be very honest about how you've done your methodology so that people can really understand everything that you've gone through, all of the steps. And sometimes journals don't necessarily allow you to say everything that you need to within the size of the paper. So thinking about using supplementary materials really efficiently so that you can add that detail that can help. And that comes down to primary research as well. As an evidence synthesis, is always very sad when I get part of the methodology, but I know that there's something missing. So having a supplementary material that fully explains that methods is really helpful. I think from a peer review perspective, I've done a few of these. Knowing the different types of evidence syntheses that are out there is very helpful because sometimes they get mixed up. So the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence has really set guidelines for different types of reviews, and knowing that you are looking for an effect or something like that, when you're looking at that type of review, it's important to be honest that you're not doing a literature narrative review, you're doing a systematic review. So being knowledgeable about the different types of reviews as a peer reviewer can help you determine what types of comments are appropriate for the type of evidence synthesis that you're reading. And that comes down to understanding what types of information are being included, what types of methodologies might be applicable, and that can help improve evidence sharing because the right types of reviews are getting to the people who need them.
Great, thanks. So I'm keeping my eye on the clock, and although I've got another question I would love to ask the panel, there's some great questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So I think if possible, in the Q&As, so if possible, perhaps we could shift to that. And I believe that somebody from CSP is going to be bringing forward a few of those for us to consider.
Yeah, there are a lot of great questions in the chat. I can start with one. Can the panelists speak to any really good examples or case studies when a synthesis was particularly impactful in environmental policy decision or intervention?
Yeah, great question, and something we're always looking for, those case studies. Anybody interested in tackling that one? Jen?
I can jump in. So one of the evidence synthesis projects that I've been involved in is well, there's two. There's systematic reviews and maps that we've done on Western-based science and respectful inclusion and weaving with Indigenous science. And that has we've done it in a series. It's been a bit of a labor of love. We did it for all of Canada with many Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners over the years. And while that is, we're still finalizing a little bit. One of the pieces that we've kind of found that really has jumped off with is it started a lot of conversation, because there are a lot of people who want to do more respectful Western-based knowledge and Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge weaving. But the question is always like, well, how do I do it? And are there, it's like the case of the case, right? It wants case studies so people can dig in and learn how to do it. And we've now published almost three of these, and they have 100%, changed what I would call small p policies on the inside of the government, and that would be a whole nother talk. But understanding what these policies are you trying to change, kind of the little p policies in terms of day-to-day operations or how things are done, or are you trying to change what I call big P policies, which is influence the Migratory Bird Convention Act, or the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. In terms of little p policies, that work has really shifted the bar on where just the government of Canada sees itself and the ability to do better knowledge weaving studies. And so that's been a huge shift. Maybe I'll leave it there. I can think of one other, but maybe I'll just leave it there, Steve.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, let's go for another question from the chat, please, Hillary.
Right. Who should undertake these systematic reviews, and could this process be biased as well?
Yeah. Maybe I can go to you on that one, Meagan, given that you're doing some work, not just about who does the syntheses, but what the evidence base looks like and how it's been created.
Yeah. So many evidence syntheses are done by topic experts. So people who know the topic really well. They understand the science, they understand how the topic has developed, and then they do an evidence synthesis on it based off of their expertise in that area. We're seeing a little bit of a change towards people who have both topic expertise and methodological expertise in evidence syntheses, bringing together kind of like the both positions. So the people who have experience in the development of evidence syntheses that follow methodological processes that have been laid out by people like the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, and then bringing topic experts in to help frame the questions, help analyze the outputs of something like a meta-analysis to really understand how those might be interpreted. I don't think that there's a limit on who should be involved in something like a systematic review. I think it really, if you are interested in the type of questions, if you're interested in learning the methodologies, I don't think that's a barrier. I think that that's a benefit. You should be involved in them as much as possible. But I really think it's important to have many voices at the table. So in most systematic reviews, it's not just one researcher doing the work. There's a team of people who are involved on the methods side. There's a team of people involved on the topic side. And we have an advisory team that brings in knowledge on the topic and the information needs, people who are in government, people who are in industry, NGOs, and they all come together to try and make the best question possible that minimizes the bias as much as possible. There's definitely risks of bias, but being upfront about those can help people understand where your biases might influence the outcomes, and then they can use that information accordingly. There's no way to have a completely unbiased study just because of the way that research works, but you can help minimize it and be really upfront and transparent about it.
Sounds good. Thanks. Okay, let's go for another question, please.
How do the panelists feel about the potential for AI applications to produce robust and timely syntheses?
John, can I go to you on this one?
Oh, thanks. I mean, we're in a brave new world. Wow. I mean, this is not an easy answer. I don't really have an answer. I'm trying to navigate my way through it. It's something that, what didn't even think about a year ago. And I mean, I'm quite stunned to see, even professors talking about how they're actively using AI to help them write grant proposals and things. And so I'm really not sure where this is taking us. Geez, of all the questions, why this one? But here, I think I just say it. We're entering a brave new world, and there's certainly ways AI is very helpful, I think, but I don't. And I'm frankly a little stunned how good it's starting to look. I mean, how the product for topics I don't know much about, I've tested it. We've all done that, I'm sure, and I'm going, wow. And of course, this is never mind a publication. I'm a professor. We're worried about how does this, assignments and so forth. How do we deal with that? Canadian Science Publishing has a policy developed on this, but this is not an easy answer. And I'm just saying, I think all I can say is we're in a brave new world, and I'm really not sure. I'd be curious what the other panelists think, but this is something that I did not see coming. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, John, maybe I'll jump in on this one too. And I think we're starting to see, again, COVID forced us to synthesize things quickly. And so there was a question that I think Jen brought up, the idea that evidence syntheses get stale, before they're even published. And so this idea of having living evidence syntheses. And so it's the healthcare space, the medical space, where they're really making some inroads there. What they have going to their advantage is that many of the study designs are quite similar. So, randomized double-blind control studies. So you can train a system to go in and repeatedly extract that kind of information from papers and then bring it in. The problem is that we, as environmental scientists, ecologists, whatever hats we wear, there's no one way to do a study. To answer a question. And that makes it much more complicated for things like AI to extract and bring things in. So I would say one thing we'll be able to do is sit back and just watch what happens in the healthcare space, and then see what that might mean for us. But like you, wearing various different hats, educator, researcher, editor, I'm somewhere between scared and slightly intrigued. I don't know. Yeah.
Can I jump in, Steve? So one thing that, and I saw a question, how is AI in relation to policy briefings? And I know for a fact there are some policy analysts in our group who have written kind of policy briefings, but I'm not even sure. It's like when they have to come up with a paragraph, they literally just need a paragraph. They have gone into AI and said, what's the current state of plastic pollution research in Canada, right? And they get their one paragraph. And I know for a fact that they have done this. I think what we're getting tripped up on, though, and I think this speaks to both John and Steve's point, is that anytime you actually need to bring a critical thinking lens and actually say, okay, well, what are the priorities? If you know the subject, it starts to stumble quickly, really fast. It becomes apparent. And when we're talking about policy briefings, I think we have this, with policymakers, policy briefings, these are kind of all abstract things. In practice, a policy briefing is not a paragraph, right? There's often a presentation, we call it deck, there's an exchange. And that's where I think AI, so just to echo Steve and John, it's exciting. I think people are using it and they're kind of getting in, but at the end of the day, people are not making decisions based on a paragraph or even a page or a paper. People still trust people and dialogue and discussion. And so I think it's the same place. People are excited and it might take off the edge of a little bit of work. Phew, no one is complaining about that. But I think we just have to keep exploring it and keep identifying that these are still people, and people want to talk to people. And so that's where there's going to be limited nuance, kind of, it's going to get lost.
Yep. Thanks, Jen. So I'm again looking at the clock because that's what I've been tasked to do, and I think we're about out of time. So a couple things. First of all, I want to thank all of you, the folks that have tuned in to watch us today. I want to thank the three panelists, Meagan, Jennifer, and John. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you for your thoughtful input. And I want to remind everybody that we just scratched the surface on all sorts of different topics here. And there are many, many things that could be blowing up. I've also seen comments coming in the chat, the Q&A. There's so much that we could dig into, and we plan on it in future webinars. So please use this as an opportunity to plant any flags, ideas there. There's some fantastic discussions to be had about what it looks like for bringing Indigenous knowledge together with Western science when we think about evidence-informed decision-making, thinking about, of course, the role of AI, and then thinking about training. So how do you actually do a high-quality evidence synthesis? What is a protocol which we're typically developing? So when you, instead of just doing your lit review, you first of all publish a protocol, which are the methods that are themselves peer reviewed. So registered reports, they're called in some spaces as well. So lots to dig into. So with that, again, a huge thanks. And on behalf of the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation, I want to thank Canada Science Publishers as a group that I've interacted with for a long time. Again, wearing different hats, originally as a student and now in some editorial capacities and obviously continuing to publish there, but for their space in supporting our communities. As researchers, we have decisions about where we publish, and I know I'm increasingly thinking about the publishers and the value added that they bring to society, to our community, and that's why we were thrilled to partner with CSP on this work. So we hope that you have found this to be of value, and we look forward to hopefully engaging with you again in the future. Thank you.